Thanks a lot for the introduction. I'm Marianne Santini. I work for the Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP. We are a global nonprofit organization, and we have programs in the US, in Europe, in China, and in India. And what we do is that we provide advice to decision makers on policies to accelerate decarbonization. And we have a special interest in heat decarbonization. And in that context, we have been seeing in the past couple of years, new types of policies emerging. And these policies we call clean heat standards. And that will be the topic of our discussion today. What I'd like to do is to first start by providing a definition of clean heat standards. I will then go through the examples we have found of these clean heat standards that are operating or that are being developed in the US and in Europe. I will present a couple of the lessons learned we found when we looked at these schemes. And then we'll open the discussion with some questions, and we're also very much interested to hear your feedback about our research. As Sam was saying, it is quite a new topic, and we are very interested to hear about any examples you would have of similar policies. So don't hesitate, if something comes to your mind, don't hesitate to drop a line in the chat box. I will look at the chat box after this call. So what are clean heat standards? Well, they are policy instruments that increase the uptake of clean heat. So this definition of clean heat, I'll get back to that because it's quite important, but it's very relevant to note that we're talking about policies here. And they do that by putting a quantitative obligation on heat market actors. So let me explain what we mean by that. So an obligation on the market actor is not an obligation on an end user. So we identified two broad families of clean heat standards. In the first family, the obligation is put on energy companies. And here, it can be different types of energy companies. So it could be those companies that supply heat, those that distribute heat. It could be an obligation put on companies that provide fossil fuel heat or on all companies that provide heat. And this kind of tools, this kind of clean heat standards, they are quite similar to other types of policies that, or other types of obligation that can be put on energy companies. And I'm thinking, for example, about renewable portfolio standards that are put in place to promote renewable energy in energy companies' energy mix, or energy efficiency obligation schemes that are obligations on energy companies to realize energy savings among their end users. Now there is a second family of clean heat standards. And we actually only have one example that is being developed in the UK. And it is a case where the obligation is put on heating appliance manufacturers. And in that respect, the tool can be compared to obligation on car manufacturers. So for example, the CO2 standards that we have in the EU, but that also exist in some states in the US. So you can compare these clean heat standards to these transport policies. Now, perhaps one remark is that heating appliance manufacturers very often have other obligation. And I'm thinking, for example, about obligation about how their products should be designed. And that's the case, for example, in the EU with eco-design requirements, which requires the product to meet a certain standard. But it's a bit, clean heat standards are a bit different from this type of eco-design policies, and I will get back to this to explain why it's a bit different. So with a clean heat standard, each obligated party has an objective to meet. And this objective is expressed differently according to what the policy is trying to achieve. So in the few examples we have found very different ways to express the target that is being put on obligated parties. And I have put some of these on the slide. And as you see, these are quite different. Usually the objective grows over time. So the ambition grows over time. It's more, you need to take more and more action in order to meet the objective. And for example, if the objective is a share of renewable heat, it means that the policy is mainly focused on renewable heat and not other objectives, and that this is the kind of action that is required to meet the objective. So now what makes clean heat standards different from other policies like eco-design requirements is that obligated parties have some flexibility in how they achieve their target. So they can decide how they are going to achieve the target. So usually there are several compliance pathways for them, not just one way of doing it. Very often they can establish a contract for delivering their target. And also in many cases, there is a possibility for obligated parties to trade compliance credits. And it's quite an important part of this flexibility element. So even when the tool is flexible, in many cases, actions eligibility is defined or restricted. So we see mainly two types of actions that are allowed. So actions that are considered as delivering clean heat. So the first type of actions, I call them downstream actions. So they are all actions taking place at end user level. So for example, replacing heating appliances or reducing heat demand through building insulation. So those are downstream actions. And then we also find in some schemes the possibility to credit upstream actions. And this is mainly about fuel switching. So replacing heating fuel with heating fuels that have a lower amount of greenhouse gas emissions attached to them. Sometimes both of these actions are allowed, and sometimes it's only one of them. And I will get back to that. And it very much depends on what the objective of the instrument is and how the target is set. So for example, if the objective of the instrument is to boost the market for heat pumps, then the target will likely be put in terms of number of heat pumps deployed. And then eligible action, of course, is heating appliance replacements. So it wouldn't make sense to be injecting heating fuels with a lower greenhouse gas to meet that obligation. I'll get back to it with some example because it's easier. So here is an overview of the examples we found in Europe and in the US. So there are actually more states in the US that are interested, but we don't have detail on the design features they are considering. So we did not include them in our review, but we will in the future when we update this research and once more examples become available. If you know about more examples around the world, don't hesitate to add them in the chat box. We'd be really interested to hear about them and include them in our further research. So as you can see, the first line is about energy companies, and the second line is about heating appliance manufacturers. On energy companies, as you can see from the right side of the table, the US examples actually allow a mix of downstream and upstream actions to be eligible. So they are quite flexible in terms of eligibility, and I'll get back to those examples. The examples we found in Europe, in France and Ireland, are limited to upstream, or at least for the time being. So the Irish scheme is still under development, so this could change, and I will get back to that. But for the moment, these are mainly blending obligations, so obligation to increase the share of renewable heat out of the heat that is being supplied. And on the second line, heating appliance manufacturers, as I mentioned, there's only one example we could find, and that was with the UK. And of course, this focuses on downstream actions only. So as I mentioned, heating appliance manufacturers, of course, have an influence on what kind of products are sold. And this is why the obligation naturally is open to downstream interventions. And I will come back to these examples in more detail. Let's start with Colorado. So in 2021, a legislation was voted, and we expect the first clean heat plants to be filed this year in 2023. So in this clean heat standards, gas distribution utilities have to file clean heat plans that explains how they will cut their emissions. And they have targets that they should meet. So it's -4% by 2025, -22% by 2030. And this is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions compared to a 2015 baseline. And there will be further targets that the Public Utilities Commission will set in the future. So the scheme is expected to continue until 2050. So as you can see on the right side of the graph, utilities have a lot of flexibility in how they meet their targets. So they can use a mix of clean heat resources that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this includes energy efficiency program, electrification programs, green gas, recovered methane. So it's really a wide eligibility. Another scheme which has a broad eligibility is in Vermont, where legislation is being developed. So it's not yet in place. And the idea there would be to cover to put an obligation on the regulated gas utility, but not only. So companies that produce or import other heating fuels like heating oil would also have an obligation. And obligated parties will have to generate or buy clean heat credits. And those clean heat credits, they come from putting in place clean heat measures. And here again, the definition about the measures is quite large with some restriction, and I will get back to that point. But overall, it is possible to put in place upstream intervention like blending and downstream interventions like energy efficiency or heating system replacement. The targets will be based on Vermont climate targets. So it will be a number of clean heat credits, but this number of clean heat credits will be actually based on the company's fair share of what they're supposed to do for Vermont to meet its climate target. What's quite original in this scheme is that everyone can generate clean heat credits, and there will be a system of trading that will be put in place. So it will also be quite interesting to see whether obligated parties decide to roll out programs themselves or whether they can get sufficient number of credits from the market. Now, moving to a slightly different tool, Ireland is considering putting in place a renewable heat obligation. So there was already a public consultation. The tool was now announced, and we're expecting another public consultation in the coming week. And the idea here would be that heating fuel suppliers will need to ensure that a certain share of the fuel they supply is renewable. And they will be able to trade credits with each other. And the heat obligation rate, which is the percentage of renewable heat that is expected from them, will grow over time. So this obligation is limited to blending. So there is no possibility to, for example, to use energy efficiency programs to meet the obligation. There is something a bit similar in France, where there is a blending obligation on biogas. But here, we need to see how this evolves, because this tool, one of the reasons this tool was considered is that Ireland wanted to meet its EU obligation under the Renewable Energy Directive. And now the Renewable Energy Directive allows member states to also count some electricity used by heat pumps as part of the clean heat obligation. So it could be that the scheme also allows that in the future. We will need to see what will be in the consultation. And now moving to the different model I was talking about, so the obligation on fossil fuel heating or on heating appliance manufacturers. We have one example, which is the UK, and it's under development. So there is a public consultation ongoing right now. And the idea would be for heating appliance manufacturers to have targets for the number of heat pumps that are sold compared to fossil fuel boilers. So there's quite a lot of detail about the design of this scheme in the public consultation, and it's quite interesting to read this detail, actually. So there will be a possibility to trade as well, and manufacturers that only produce heat pumps will be able to sell credits for the heat pumps that are installed by them. So the obligation is on fossil fuel heating appliance manufacturers, but there will be credits put on the market by heat pump manufacturers. So here is a summary of those 4 selected examples. There are more examples in our report if you're interested, and we will continue gathering examples and design features. So as you see, what we call clean heat standards, these tools, but they're quite diverse. The starting point is always that in these places, governments realized that there was a gap in terms of the policies put in place to decarbonize heat. And as you can see from the first line, the type of obligated party can be a bit different. From the second line, you will see the target can be expressed differently. And on the third line, you will see that the eligible actions also can be different. So under clean heat standards, we call clean heat standards tools that are very different from each other. These are all quite new tools or tools that are under development. So we are still figuring out what their role will be in the future policy framework. Now they are quite similar to other tools in energy efficiency, in renewable policy, or in transport policy. So we have some trust that these tools could actually work and deliver some benefits. So we think they can help with emissions cuts, that they can bring benefits to end users, including low-income households, and that they can provide a signal to the clean heating supply chain. This, of course, depends how they are designed. So some design features will help achieve some of those goals. And also, it depends how they fit with how they work with other policies in the heat space. So, for example, we think that clean heat standards could work well with bans on fossil fuel boilers, because we think that clean heat standards can help prepare the market. Now, moving to the lessons learned, we think that clean heat standard can set a trajectory for heat decarbonization and facilitate an end date for the sale of fossil fuel boilers. So I'm going to show a graph which captures the sales of heating devices in Europe. And in blue, you have the number of condensing boilers, and in green, the heat pumps. Of course, this is changing now. In the past 2 years that are not captured in this graph because data was not complete when we completed it. So the number of heat pumps is growing, but we're still selling a lot of fossil fuel boilers. And these boilers, they will stay in our homes for quite some time. So we think that there will be a need for policies to prepare the market for scaling up clean devices, but also once, even after those fossil fuel boilers are not on sales anymore, we think it will still be we will still need policy to go and actively remove the boilers from homes if we are to meet our climate targets. So we're looking into the role that clean heat standards would play in that context, and we'd be very glad to hear your views. Another lessons learned is that we think that a clean heat standard can support the just energy transition. And we think that this requires a very careful design. So those who design the scheme should really think about who pays and who benefits from the standard. But we have seen some examples, for example, in Vermont, where there is a sub-target for low-income households in the scheme. So low-income households would benefit from the actions that energy companies are putting in place. And that is a target that is mandatory for obligated parties to meet. So this is an example of how design features can actually help the tool deliver benefits for the just energy transition. We think also that decision makers that are designing a clean heat standard can ensure that the clean heat solutions promoted by the policy does not create locks in. So that is linked to how we define clean heat. Decision makers have the flexibility, they have the possibility to exclude some solutions if they think it's not a good idea for the energy transition. So again, an example in Vermont, there the idea is that replacing a fossil fuel boiler with a more efficient fossil fuel boiler would not be eligible under the clean heat standards because while this would reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a certain extent, this would actually lock in the households into having a technology that they might have to replace shortly after because of decarbonisation targets. So we think that it is possible to address these issues through the design of the clean heat standards. Another and final lesson is that we think decision makers can build on existing policies, including energy efficiency obligation scheme, if it's relevant in the national context. So we found some examples where a country actually had an energy efficiency obligation scheme running, and they decided to boost heating actions under that scheme. And this is the case in France, where you can get a bonus for heating system replacements. Now you could argue that it could have made also, you could argue that it could be possible to include a sub-target in order to secure the number of heating system replacements that is being achieved by the scheme. So it is another possibility that decision makers may have. I have put in the slides a number of resources on the work we have done on the topic. And we will do further research on this issue, so don't hesitate to get in touch if you are interested. And with that last slide, I will finish my presentation.